Some stories from World War II were never meant to be told. Hidden battles, forgotten heroes, moments history almost erased. Real stories, no myths, only history. Hello everyone. Today we're going to witness one of the most humiliating moments in Nazi history. The moment when Germany's most powerful general walked into Allied headquarters expecting respect and instead was treated like a criminal. What happened inside a small schoolhouse in France in May 1945 reveals how the Third Reich truly ended. Not with glory, but with silence, pressure, and a single signature that destroyed it forever.
May 6th, 1945. Reims, France. The war in Europe was collapsing, but the final act had not yet been written. Rain fell steadily over the quiet French city, turning the streets into dull rivers of grey mud. Military trucks rolled slowly through intersections guarded by armed sentries, and the atmosphere carried the strange tension of a moment when history itself seemed to be holding its breath. Inside a modest red brick schoolhouse on the outskirts of the city, the fate of the entire European continent was about to be decided. This building had been transformed into the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, known simply as SHAEF. It was not a palace or a grand government hall. It was an ordinary school building with narrow hallways and simple wooden rooms. Yet within those walls stood the men who had commanded the largest military force ever assembled. American officers moved quietly through the corridors, carrying stacks of documents. British staff officers whispered to one another while glancing at their watches. French representatives sat near the far end of a long table, speaking in low voices. Soviet officers stood stiffly near the walls, watching everything carefully, saying little. The room itself was heavy with cigarette smoke and nervous anticipation. Coffee cups sat half empty across the tables. Some of the generals had been awake for nearly 20 hours. Everyone knew the moment they were waiting for would end the war in Europe, but no one yet knew exactly how it would unfold. Outside the building, military police had sealed off the entire area. Jeeps blocked the roads, soldiers checked every vehicle that passed, and armed guards stood at every entrance. No one entered without authorization. The Allies were preparing for the arrival of a man who represented the final authority of Nazi Germany's collapsing military command. Late in the afternoon, a black staff car finally appeared on the wet road leading towards the headquarters. The vehicle slowed as it approached the gate. Guards stepped forward, papers were examined. The gate opened. When the door of the car opened, the man who stepped out looked exactly like the image many Allied officers had carried in their minds for years. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of operations for the German High Command, had arrived. For 6 years, Jodl had been one of the most powerful men in the German war machine. He had signed operational orders for campaigns that reshaped the entire continent. The invasions of Poland, France, the Soviet Union, his signature had appeared beneath many of the directives that launched those operations. His authority had stretched across armies, fronts, and millions of soldiers. Yet, despite the complete collapse of Germany's military position, Jodl still carried himself with the posture of a confident officer. He stepped from the car wearing a perfectly pressed German uniform. His iron cross hung prominently from his neck. A monocle rested in his eye, giving him the appearance of an old Prussian aristocrat rather than the representative of a defeated regime. To many observers, it seemed almost surreal. Germany had lost the war. Berlin had fallen. Adolf Hitler was already dead in his bunker. Yet here stood one of Hitler's highest generals, walking into Allied headquarters with the calm arrogance of a man who still believed he deserved respect. Inside his mind, Jodl expected a certain kind of meeting. He believed he would be greeted by the supreme Allied commander himself, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He imagined a formal conversation between professional soldiers. There would be negotiation, discussion, perhaps even a drink shared between officers who had spent years fighting one another. In Jodl's world, wars ended with ceremonies between gentlemen. But the Allied leadership had something very different in mind. As Jodl walked through the entrance and down the hallway of the schoolhouse, the atmosphere around him was noticeably cold. No one greeted him warmly. Allied officers watched him pass, with expressions that revealed neither respect nor sympathy. Down the hall, inside a modest office, General Dwight D. Eisenhower had already been informed that the German delegation had arrived. Eisenhower was not pacing the floor. He was not preparing a speech. He sat calmly behind his desk, reviewing documents. An aide stepped into the room and quietly informed him that Colonel General Jodl was waiting. Eisenhower did not stand up. Instead, he looked at the officer and delivered a short instruction that would immediately define the tone of the entire surrender. He said that he would not meet the German general, he would not shake his hand, and he would not speak with him. The German representative was not here to negotiate. He was here to surrender. That single decision shattered the expectations Jodl had carried with him from Germany. The ceremony he had imagined would not happen. The dignity he expected would not be offered. Instead of negotiations between equals, the German delegation would spend the next 24 hours sitting in a tense room while the Allies dictated the complete collapse of the Third Reich. And if you're interested in these real moments of history that many documentaries skip over, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the like button. It helps us keep telling these incredible stories. Back in the headquarters building, the German delegation began to realize something unsettling. This was not a negotiation, it was the final chapter of Nazi Germany, and the Allies were the ones writing it. May 7th, 1945, Reims, France. The tension in the air had not lifted since the German delegation had arrived the day before. Rain had stopped, leaving the streets of the city sleek and grey, reflecting the dull light of an overcast sky. The Allies were acutely aware that the final hours of the European war were unfolding inside this modest schoolhouse. But outside, the city seemed oblivious. Civilians moved quietly between puddles and debris. Soldiers on patrol occasionally glanced toward the windows of the headquarters, and the distant rumble of artillery, though faint, reminded everyone that war's shadow still lingered. Inside the schoolhouse, the atmosphere was heavy with expectation. Allied officers had reorganized the rooms, placing large oak tables to accommodate the German delegation. The documents that would end the war lay stacked and sealed, each one a tangible measure of surrender and collapse. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, along with his aides, had been seated for hours in a corner room, aware that the Allies controlled the pace, the terms, and the narrative of history itself. He had hoped for negotiation, for a formal ceremony that would allow him to maintain a semblance of dignity. But that hope had been extinguished the moment he stepped into the building. The Germans were left waiting, and waiting, and waiting. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, seated calmly behind his desk, reviewed maps and reports, while aides moved silently, passing papers, updating communications, and quietly monitoring the clock. Every minute Jodl spent waiting amplified the psychological weight of the surrender. He was no longer a general issuing commands to battalions. He was a man stripped of authority, forced to confront the totality of his nation's defeat. Outside, military police maintained a tight perimeter. Every vehicle that approached the schoolhouse was scrutinized. Armed guards patrolled the streets, their presence a subtle reminder that no act of subterfuge could alter the Allies' control. Yet, inside, the tension was more nuanced than the visible security. It was a test of patience, discipline, and the quiet assertion of power over someone who had once commanded armies. Jodl's mind raced as he contemplated the gravity of the situation. He remembered the campaigns he had orchestrated, the invasions, the operations, the relentless orders that had cost millions of lives. And now, the instruments of his authority were nothing more than ink on paper, awaiting signatures that would nullify years of power. When the time finally came, an aide quietly informed Jodl that he would be escorted to the signing room. The Germans rose, their movements precise but heavy with unease. Allied officers guided them through corridors, past rooms filled with maps detailing Europe's shattered front lines, past offices where clerks typed and filed every detail of the surrender. Each step seemed to emphasize the reversal of roles. The man who had once dictated movements across entire armies now obeyed instructions, guided by the very forces he had sought to resist. As they entered the main signing room, Jodl saw Eisenhower for the first time, not rising to greet him, not acknowledging the German delegation with words or gestures. The Supreme Allied Commander's calm presence conveyed authority without theatrics. No handshakes, no smiles, no negotiation. The message was clear. This was not a meeting between equals. This was the moment when power had been stripped, and history itself was being written in real time. Jodl approached the table, noting the meticulous organization. Documents were aligned, ink prepared, and witnesses, including generals from America, Britain, and France, observed silently. Eisenhower gestured for Jodl to sign, and he did. With each stroke of the pen, the war that had engulfed Europe for 6 brutal years came closer to its formal end. The ink dried on the paper, but the weight of the act was felt by everyone in the room. Jodl's shoulders sagged slightly, the first visible sign of the realization that nothing remained in his hands but responsibility for the devastation his orders had caused. After the signatures were complete, Jodl and his aides were escorted back to their holding rooms. Allied officers remained composed, yet the room carried an almost tangible relief. Years of planning, fighting, and sacrifice had culminated in this quiet yet decisive moment. Outside, soldiers continued their patrols. Civilians whispered about the end of hostilities, and the rain-slick streets reflected a sky that was beginning to lighten, as if Europe itself exhaled after a prolonged period of fear and destruction. Though the surrender had been formalized, the psychological aftermath lingered. For the Allies, it was a moment of triumph tempered by reflection on the human cost of war. For Jodl, it was an encounter with the truth that no military campaign could prepare him for. That power, when absolute, could dissolve in a single act of discipline, and that arrogance could be rendered meaningless by silence and resolve. The surrender in Reims was not just a document, it was the culmination of strategy, patience, and moral authority asserted without violence. Allied officers allowed a brief respite, ensuring that Jodl and his aides were fed, given water, and provided seats. Despite the years of brutality they had orchestrated, there was no personal vengeance taken in the room. The surrender was legal, formal, and total. Yet, the human element, the tension, the pride, the subtle assertion of control remained, and it lingered in every gaze, every gesture, every silent moment in the hallways of the red brick schoolhouse. By evening, the German delegation had been fully processed. Communications were sent to headquarters in London, Moscow, and Washington, confirming the cessation of hostilities in Europe. The Red Cross was notified. Orders were sent to cease hostilities, to manage prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, and to secure all military assets. The world outside began to register the end of an era, though few understood the full complexity of the surrender and the weight of the decisions made that day. As night fell over Reims, the rain had finally stopped. The city lay quiet, but the memory of the day's events would echo for generations. Allied officers prepared reports, filed documents, and contemplated the next steps in rebuilding a continent devastated by war. Colonel General Jodl and his aides rested under guard, their status now that of prisoners, their influence nullified, their legacy intertwined with history's judgment. And so, the surrender in Reims marked not just the end of battles, but the final assertion of order over chaos, of law over arbitrary power, and of patience and discipline over arrogance and hubris. It was a lesson in how wars end not with glory alone, but with meticulous, deliberate acts that shape the course of history. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the most critical and overlooked moments of World War II. I hope this story gave you a new perspective on the human and strategic decisions that shaped the end of the European conflict. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss more stories that history textbooks often leave out. Until next time, from Untold World War II, stay curious and see you in the next story.